Hello everyone. Welcome to AgileCast, a podcast series for Agile enthusiasts from Zibia Agile Community of Consulting and Transformation, in short known as ZACT. ZACT is a community of seasoned Agile coaches and passionate Agile enthusiasts. AgileCast is our attempt to strengthen and enrich the community by making Agile a ZACT science. As part of this initiative, we will be picking up trending topics and pertinent questions related to the world of Agile and product development. We will be sharing our experiences here through this platform. We live by our core value of knowledge sharing, which is the only way you learn and care about your community. Apart from the podcast series, we have also been hosting webinars, meetups, annual conference named Agile NCR, and also contribute by publishing blogs and papers. My name is Anil Kadakol. I am an Agile transformation consultant and coach. In this series, which is the 22nd episode of AgileCast, I am going to talk about theory of constraints and agility. How many times we have seen or heard of things going downhill in an organizational setup? The teams are working harder and harder, mounting financial pressures, quality issues, tough competition, escalations from customer, hiring problems, supplier issues, tempers running high, war rooms, blame games and whatnot. Well, how to turn around things in such a situation? Can there be a method in all this madness? Where should we even begin to resolve such a chaotic situation? How do we go about addressing things? The protagonist of the wonderful classical book The Goal by Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt fights exactly on something similar to save his business and also fix his family life all at the same time. Let's look at an interesting story from the book. Alex, the central character in the book, takes a break from all the stress at work and takes his son's scout group on a hike in the mountains. While hiking along, he notices that some boys keep lagging further and further behind. He shuffles some kids around, putting the quicker boys in the front, thinking that they would set the right pace. But the laggards keep falling further behind. So even though they all start out together, some boys don't produce steps at the same rate as others. Thus, in a matter of few minutes, they start falling behind. The more they fall behind, the less incentive they have to hurry up. Upon closer examination, Alex discovers Herbie is the slowest boy in the line. Wherever Herbie is, everyone behind him lags further and further behind. In short, Herbie is the constraint. And he determined the overall speed of the group. No matter how fast any of the other boys went, they would ultimately have to wait for Herbie. The fastest the line would go was Herbie's speed. Eventually, after a few experiments, Alex moved Herbie to the front of the line and nobody lagged behind. Herbie went a bit faster as well, simply because now he was leading the group. Then Alex realized Herbie was carrying way too much baggage, so he distributed the contents of Herbie's overloaded pack to the taller and stronger boys. Herbie picked up further pace again. Now, marching at Herbie's new speed, the troop arrived at their destination camp in good time. As we see from this story, it is counterproductive for the group if each of the boys hits their fastest speed. There is clearly no point for everyone to walk faster than the constraint. It makes much more sense to focus all the efforts on making the constraint go faster, which will set the pace of the whole group. The idea of the hike is not to see who can get there the fastest, but rather the goal is to get there together as a team. The team does not arrive in the camp until each and every boy in the team safely makes it. This simple story teaches us wonderful insights, and we can easily relate this to many of our team-based situations we face in an organization. Likewise, every organization has constraints, and according to the theory of constraints, organizations are prevented from achieving their goals because of one or more constraints. Breaking the constraint means to continuously improve the system such that the current constraint is improved so that it is no longer a constraint. The process is then repeated for the next constraint, and this journey goes on. What kind of improvements can lead in dramatic increase in throughput? How to identify the constraints and how to break the constraints and to move on to the next constraint. These are some of the questions we shall address as we are reaching the very heart of the theory of constraints, which is the continuous improvement method to increase throughput in any system of value creation. This theory has been applied in many diverse industries, including manufacturing, operations, supply chain, finance, project management, marketing, sales, and others. The theory puts forth a process, the well-known 5 focusing steps for breaking the constraint. They are identifying the constraint, exploiting the constraint, subordinating everything to the constraint, elevate the constraint, and lastly, prevent inertia from becoming the constraint. These are also known as the process of ongoing improvements. Now let's examine each of the 5 focusing steps, particularly through the lens of IT product development. Let's look at the first step of identifying the constraint. This tells us where to focus our improvement efforts, since we know that only an improvement at the constraint makes a significant difference. Other way to approach this topic could be to simply act on the entire list of anti-patterns and go all out to solving them. Improving every problem may not necessarily lead to improving the system as a whole, just as we saw in the hiking story. Software projects are complex webs of many interconnected activities. Are there constraints in the database, the network, the architecture, or the program code? Are there team-related constraints? Has quality become a constraint and the reason for the sales to dip? There could be many different constraints as well. Suppose you are on a team with 5 developers and 1 part-time shared tester across teams. Most likely the constraint here is the tester. Adding few more developers will not increase the overall throughput of this team unless the developers also act as testers. If this team wants to produce more software, they need to first address the constraint of having only a part-time tester. Transparency being one of the pillars in agile-based development, and when implemented in the right manner, helps us to look for these constraints in individuals and their interactions rather than what we used to do traditionally, like to look for it in the project plan, detailed process descriptions, requirement documentation, other artifacts, and tools. We'll now look at the second step, exploiting the constraint. The output of the constraint or bottleneck determines the output of the team or the organization. It is therefore absolutely important to maximize the utilization and the productivity of the constraint. Before adding capacity, we need to use the capacity we already have more efficiently. Getting the best value from the bottleneck is the key. How can this be done? We will look at a few ways now. Both the upstream and the downstream of the constraint needs to be thoroughly controlled and managed. Just as from the story of hiking, Herbie's overloaded pack was distributed to others to enable him to move faster, so do whatever it takes to offload or reduce the burden of the constraint. Avoid sending poor quality inputs to the constraint. The quality checks must be done before so that we are conserving the efforts of the constraint to work on things which really matter. Make sure all dependencies are resolved well in advance and do not make the constraint to wait. The constraint output may need to be integrated with another team's work in order to get business value. If that team fails to do their part, you have wasted the energy and time at the bottleneck. Don't have the constraint spend time doing work what others can do. In other words, make it as much easier as possible for the constraint. All these activities are more economical and efficient to implement rather than adding capacity to improve the performance of the team. We will now look at the third step, subordinate everything to the constraint. By definition, any non-constraint has more capacity to produce than the constraint itself. Left unchecked, this results in bloated WIP inventory and elongated lead times. Hence, it is crucial to avoid producing more than the constraint can handle. It is important to ensure that everyone knows where the constraint is and they need to drop anything they are doing if the constraint needs their assistance. Ensure that the constraint never has to wait for a specialist assistance. This can be done by allocating a specialist to the team, allocating them physically close to the team, make working agreements explicit, or re-architect the process to remove the need for a specialist, etc. Finally, leave a small slack in the non-bottleneck activities. This is done so that we don't want anyone upstream from the bottleneck to find themselves too busy and start the bottleneck or break a commitment to the bottleneck team. We will now look at the fourth step, elevate the constraint. The things we have discussed so far are about improving throughput of the system by getting the most out of the constraint as it is. Elevate the constraint means to improve the constraint. It's one of the most expensive options and usually has a lag before the benefit arrives. Therefore, it's one of the later focusing steps. There are many ways to elevate the constraint, and adding more people is probably the last option to consider. The better options are provide training, improve tooling, and automation. These steps impact the constraint directly. It would be good to supplement them with team building, team collaboration, and things that would keep the team motivated. Lastly, let us look at prevent inertia from becoming the constraint. The inevitable result of the first 4 steps may break the constraint. Therefore, once it is resolved and no longer a constraint, the next part of the system that has become the constraint should be addressed following the same previous steps. This step insists that you start back at the beginning and don't let inertia become the constraint. This is a reminder to never become satisfied and keep addressing the constraints constantly. Let's now look at some of the application scenarios or examples of theory of constraint related topics which I have observed in the teams working in the IT product development. Scenario 1. Key person risk. We have often seen critical resources in many of our teams. They could be developers, architects, domain specialists, or maybe donning any other roles. And sometimes it so happens that team begins to completely rely on them for certain activities. Make no mistake about it, they may possess extraordinary skill set and a deep expertise to handle complexities. There is also the threat of complete disruption to the system if this person is absent or if they move out. Apparently, from a system perspective, they eventually become bottlenecks in spite of their talent and heroic acts. Work cannot flow through the system faster than they can process. The best solution is to make the teams fully cross-functional and highly collaborative so that they can do all the work required to get the software into production and the dependency on a key person is minimized. Let's move on to scenario 2, capacity issue. The capacity question is such a common one. We have already seen in Elevate the Constraint step that adding more team capacity is probably the last option you should consider. In fact, the Brooks law states that adding capacity to a late software project makes it even later. There is a ramp-up time for the people to become productive. Communication overhead increases as the number of people go up. Adding more people to a highly divisible task decreases the overall task duration. However, in the software context, the tasks are generally less divisible, and so adding capacity can be counterproductive at times. Before adding capacity, we need to use the capacity we already have more efficiently. Also in the IT product development, it is often about getting the prioritization right by effectively collaborating with the product owners to maximize the business value. Let's move on to scenario 3, local optimization. The whole system needs to be optimized and not just a local process. It is often seen that only a few teams have adopted Agile in an organization. Though the delivery capability of some of these teams may improve, there is hardly any traction seen at the overall system level. Taking this even further, many organizations adopting Agile find that the initial focus is mainly on the IT function, but the business are much slower to adopt. Applying the theory of constraints, there is no point improving the efficiency of the IT delivery capability by 10 or 20% if the burning problems for the organization are on the business side. Evan Laburn is the founder and CEO of the Business Agility Institute. Inspired by the theory of constraints, there is a quote from him which states that an organization can only be as agile as its least agile division. There will always be constraints to achieve business agility. The key is not to just stop adopting agility at the IT department or few localized functions, but to continuously keep on moving to the next constraint in the system. Next in the chain could be operations or continuous delivery, and then expanding the scope further to include other organizational functions like finance, human resources, etc. This relentless continuous improvement is in essence the pursuit for business agility. Finally, to summarize and conclude, this quote from Dr. Goldratt summarizes it aptly. Any improvements made anywhere besides the bottleneck are an illusion. It is important to understand the true goal of the organization. With the goal in mind, identify and focus on the bottleneck. Fix it until it no longer is, and then find the next one in the system. Then repeat the process over and over again. Continually identifying, exploiting, and attacking bottlenecks will maximize throughput over time. The beauty of theory of constraint is that it simplifies complex situations with unique and easy to understand answers. It helps management focus on what is important by identifying individual constraints that inhibit the organization from achieving its goals. This is not only the fastest way to achieving exponential growth, but also creates a path for achieving true business agility in an organization. There you have it, theory of constraints and agility. Hope you found it useful. Thank you.